If fog could talk, it would be in a language unrecognizable to anyone on the planet. It would speak in discreet and mysterious echoes and whispers. You would find yourself walking through a shadowy and unumbrated forest, and every now and then you might hear what sounds like the last scintilla of a syllable scurrying between the trees and leaves. And you might think that you hear a snatch of a word, of a phrase, of a memory, of a lingering from long ago that stirs something up unconscious within you, but which you cannot articulate or put into solid form. It almost threatens to make sense and then dissolves back into something mysterious that lurks beyond the threshold of your conscious mind. I say all of this as a discursive way of introducing the fact that I would like to make a video today about the 12th house, which is the most mysterious, esoteric and easy to misunderstand of all of the houses, perhaps because it is in love with the mystery of its own misunderstanding. It lurks in the shadowy interzone and integumental realm between one cycle ending and another beginning, where everything that was once solid and reified and certain dissolves and gives way to deliquescence of the soul. And because of this, people who have natal 12th house placements often also have an evasive quality to them. There is this sense of there being this enormous weight of things unsaid and unexpressed that is hiding behind the scenes, almost on the tip of their tongue, but never quite coming out, being this thing that they're always having to conceal or wrap a shroud of mystery and undiscovery around. Sometimes this is conscious, sometimes it is unconscious, but I feel one of the main reasons that a lot of 12th house people feel the need to enshroud themselves in some kind of mystery to make them a visible enigma to others is usually to do with their upbringing. Though all of us can experience rejection and alienation and a sense of not belonging in our lives, I find with 12th house people that sense of having had to surrender or sacrifice something that many others take for granted, but which seems to be inaccessible to them, has been a cornerstone of their experience of this world. Many 12th house people grow up feeling like this world was not really made for them, that they are not earthlings, that they are not denizens of this temporal plane. They have that sense that they come from somewhere else, from another world that functions more according to the laws of magic and imagination, rather than the apparently hard and fast Newtonian cause and effect world that so many of us exist in and struggle with. And because of that sense of being misplaced, of being placed in the wrong realm, of having to adapt to a physicality that is not natural to them, there is that prolonged sense of being an outsider, of being a bird placed in the wrong nest, of being the wrong child who got taken home. And sometimes that feeling doesn't necessarily bear much relation to that person's history, but very often it can just be that sense of growing up in a culture or growing up in an environment or community where everyone seems to express values, needs, cultural certainties and fears and prejudices that in no way reflect who you are. In fact, very often you might feel like you are the antithesis of what everyone else is standing for and fighting for, and that they believe and so ardently express. You are a stranger somehow in your own neighborhood, a black sheep. And that sense of being an outcast, of having questions that you are not meant to ask, of having beliefs and experiences and perceptions and senses that no one has taught you are supposed to have. In fact, people may have even done the opposite and told you that you're not meant to experience life that way unless something is deeply wrong with you, unless you are mentally ill or insane or too sensitive or not quite fit for this world. All of those things can just send the message that there is something that prevents you from being immediately subsumed and welcomed and accepted by the great mass of the rest of humanity. And it's interesting that the 12th house is placed next to the 11th house, which is the house of friendships and groups. So it's almost like if you have friendships, groups, communities, and people coming together as a mass with a shared aim, goal, or sense of socio-political ideologies all accumulated over here, what happens for the people who can't find their group? What happens for the people who don't find their place in society, who don't find that network of united individuals that they can feel a sense of belonging and communion with? What happens to them? They disappear into the 12th house. They are like a puzzle piece that cannot neatly fit in with any of the existing frameworks that have already been constructed. And when you feel yourself to be that way, there can be a number of different survival options that people develop in order to cope with this. And I mentioned the fact that so many 12th house people can have very pronounced imaginations, and people who are naturally drawn to kind of fantastical and mythopoeic and symbolic imagery that seems to speak to them of higher realms. And I feel one of the main reasons that the imagination becomes more pronounced for 12th house people is that if you feel like an outsider, if you feel like an outcast, if you feel like there's lots of experiences that you are closed off from and do not have the privilege of experiencing in the real world as a physical act, the 12th house is still a watery house. It still has emotional longings and needs. And if those needs cannot be manifest in a physical way, we instead find a way of satisfying them in our imagination. If we can't be close to others, then we imagine wonderful, idealized friendships. We imagine a world or a planet or a fairy realm where we could belong. We imagine music that sounds like the music we want to hear, that sounds like the hymnology and symphonies of our extraplanetary homeland. We imagine the loves and romances that are so different and devoid of the cold or isolated or marginalized experience we might feel generally in our socializations with others. So I often feel a bit annoyed sometimes when 12th house people are just accused merely of escapism, because escapism always sounds like a negative act. It says that reality is this definite, solid, logical, physical, Capricornian, manifest, Saturnine world here, and if you can't adapt to this, and if you don't fit in with this, and if you don't recognize its rules and follow rigidly along with them, then there must be something critically wrong with you, and off to the monastery or the madhouse go you. It's failing to recognize that people withdraw into their imaginations, whether through meditation, whether through contemplation, whether through daydreaming, whether through video games or alcoholism or any more exaggerated expression of this need, because we have a need to contact the spiritual realm as well as the physical. We have a need to get lost in infinite realms of possibility, to dissolve into a rainbow cloudscape of impossible colours. We have this need within us, and for those who are more spiritually attuned, who have, that sense of having lived many lives and lived many universes, going back to that is the closest they can get to going home. Home isn't necessarily this place in this geophysical space. It isn't It isn't that postcode, it isn't that cute little house that you grew up with your mum and dad. It's something more mysterious that points to your pre-existence. For Christians it might be heaven, for Hindus it might be moksha, for Jungians it might be the womb-like nature of the infinite unconscious mind. But whatever it is, there is still that sense of needing to return to that source, to refresh our souls. It's a bit like if we live too much in the earthly realm and we obey its stern, rigid, draconian laws too insistently, then we start to dry out. We need water to keep us moisturized, to keep us hydrated, to stop our soul becoming a desert that ends up being dry and desiccated and unreceptive to everything, cracking and frittering and flaking away in horrible squamous cells of desuetude. We need water. And in many traditions and in many religions, water is used as a symbol for the refreshment of the spirit. You know, in the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as someone who can give us living water that will never make us thirsty again. And it's not referring to physical water, but to the never-ending rivers and oceans of the spirit. And through imagining and through dreaming and through sleeping and through finding ways of checking out of the monotony of this conscious world, we can tap back into that source and we can feel refreshed and restored by it. I suddenly know that, you know, there were many times earlier this year where I was working very hard and it felt like every a moment of my day was being tyrannized by the demands to survive and keep on working. And those brief moments where I could disappear back into that 12th house realm, when I was just on the bus home from work and I could listen to music and just disappear into the purity of those sounds and just lose some of the rigid outlines of my body, where I could lie in the bath and feel myself becoming one with the water and feel myself being liberated from the heaviness and cares of the day through the music that is carrying me ethereally upward, then I'm being healed by that. And that is not escapism, that is healing, that is refreshment, that is touching base with your source, with your spiritual home, as we do in meditation, so that you can be nurtured and ready to face that world again. And, you know, this is one of the crucial reasons why the 12th house is the final house before we get the first house. The first house is the zone of birth. It is the zone of manifestation. It is the zone where we get out of bed, we open the front door and we embrace the world and have to do something, where we have a desire and we have to chase it, where we have to make things happen. But what do we do every night before we do that? We go to sleep. We go to sleep and dream. And by having that big old chunk of the 12th house there, it's saying we need that dream space. We need that dream time so that we can keep going cyclically with that cycle. And if that is not respected, then we are more likely to find ourselves in circumstances where the 12th house invades our waking light, where we are consumed by strange emotions or weird delusions or persistent dreams and fears because we have not had enough time just to sit with ourselves and our soul and acknowledge the spiritual elements of our being. So if 12th house people can often be evasive or don't express themselves in a straightforward, clear manner, or you can often get that sense that they are avoiding saying what they really want or need to say, that is usually from their protective conditioning. That if you've been bullied or rejected for being different, for having ideas, thoughts or feelings that don't seem to easily fit in with the rest of the collective, you may have even experienced moments where you were a first house person or 11th house person. You did take that bold move to say, these are the things I love. These are the things that I feel and experience. This is what reality is like for me. And if you got snubbed for expressing those things, perhaps even bullied and actively hurt and abused for expressing your experience of reality, you may have quickly learned that, okay, it's best that I don't cross that line into the first house. It's best that I don't express myself too openly. It's best that I be a bit cryptic and enigmatic for the sake of keeping myself safe. And this is why 12th house people often have a shapeshifter quality to them, because it's almost this case of, okay, if I can't reveal my true self, because I will be bullied or rejected from it, or at least that's what my experiences have told me, I will adapt myself to put on whatever face the current scenario I'm in seems to demand. We adapt and give the appearance and glamour of being what we think is appropriate in that time. And there is this sense of one's identity of not necessarily being something that is definite and solid, but something that is more fluid. And sometimes there can be a passivity to this. You know, again, the 12th house is a watery house. Water doesn't naturally choose to dominate things. It chooses to flow around things and fill in the gaps and spaces of whatever it is there. And 12th house people often have that knack of doing that, of somehow filling in that space, of pooling into that specific area in an unconscious way, and therefore providing others and themselves with some fleeting sense of wholeness. But the fear of bullying, being bullied and being rejected isn't necessarily always the whole picture of it as well. Sometimes there is that sense that if you are inhabiting that realm of a big cosmic oceanic consciousness, or living in the world of the imagination, there is so much in that imagistic, mythopoeic, symbolic realm that is not easily reduced into the two-dimensional nature of most language that likes to give things a fixed and permanent form. Things in the 12th realm have no fixed and permanent form. Even when they're archetypes, they still move and express themselves in many dimensions. And there is sometimes a feeling that if there is that withheld part of themselves, it's almost because there is so much that they could give or express or say and never finish saying, that the task of doing so is exhausting, because it's a case of taking the infinite and bastardizing it by reducing it into the finite. And that can be a difficult thing for a lot of 12th house people to accept. You know, I read an interesting article by Dana Earhart recently, where she found that a lot of 12th house people could be very successful, that they weren't all the dropouts, bums and starving artists that you would necessarily expect them to be. She said that a lot of planets in the 12th house could be in place natally, could be very powerful, could be the source of someone's great success and fame and victory in this world, but that usually it took a lot longer to have the courage to reveal that and give it to the world than other placements do, whereas planets in the first house or in the 10th house give of themselves very generously and openly and confidently and boldly, because they almost have no choice, because that energy has to be extroverted. Usually planets in the 12th need to spend a lot of time being refined and mastered and developed in secret, and maybe tentatively teetering over the horizon every now and then to show itself, and then disappearing back behind the curtain if it gets scared. But it needs more time to develop. You know, the 12th house is a womb-like space, and it's almost like this incredibly gifted child, this Messiah, this Christ child that could come into the world and do something amazing, but for the time being, it's still a helpless baby. It's still a little child, and even if it's prophesied to become the next Messiah, the next Saviour, if someone got hold of it before it was ready to begin its ministry, then it would be killed, because it would be too gentle and too innocent and too fleshy and vulnerable to be able to stand up for itself. You know, I think it's interesting, again, if we use the New Testament and as an example, that there's this kind of big lacunae between the birth of Christ, this long period where he was growing up, apparently as a normal child, and then in his 30s where he begins his ministry and starts causing chaos. And you have this long, shadowy period that isn't referred to in the four main Gospels at all. It's like, what was he doing during that period? And it can be a bit like that with the 12th house, that before we feel that confidence to go out and show that hidden planet to the world, and to be that and embody that, there has to be a lot of time where things are kept in secrecy until they are ready to reveal themselves. And it's interesting sometimes when we look at 12th house transits, or also transits and progressions of Neptune as well, that they often seem to mark these periods where, not necessarily where things are happening, but where things aren't happening. Don't get me wrong, there can be very active times during those transits, but very often it can be this period where we are kind of left in suspense. We are like Odysseus, stuck on an island, or someone just adrift, like the ancient mariner, adrift on becalmed waters that aren't moving, where we can't get anywhere, where everything has slowed down to this stasis. And because we can't make any movement forward in the material and external world, we are more or less forced to pay attention to our spiritual world, which is the only place where anything is happening. So it's almost like we have to go through that period of enforced inwardness and isolation and stillness and absence of activity to generate the spiritual force to ready ourselves for that moment when we do finally feel capable of thrusting ourselves out there into the world, where we are ready to take birth, to take form, to have a definite direction. But there is that acceptance that this takes longer. And I think that's the element of waiting that can be so frustrating, and which can generate so much fear and confusion when we are trapped in the 12th house, is that we don't know when things can move forwards again. And often we find that that ability to move forwards is something that we don't necessarily have a choice about. For instance, to use that example of the ancient mariner being becalmed on a completely still ocean, is that he couldn't move forwards into the next part of his quest until the ocean waves started moving again and some kind of current and wind returned. That was not something he could consciously control. And very often in the 12th house, we find that we are obstructed or blocked or held back by things that prevent us from moving forward until finally we are released. It makes me think of the biography I read of Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, that even though she became a very powerful empress, one of the most powerful women in history, before she reached that first house point of coming out into the world as this powerful and recognized figure, for a long time she was a princess married to a prince in a very stifling and abusive situation that was tantamount to prison. She remained like that for a long time before eventually enough people had died that she could take the throne. These were things that she could not actively control herself. She just had to wait to that point until she was released from these circumstances by the machinations of fate, and could therefore actually become the Empress. And again, to go back to the analogy of the 12th house as being like the womb, it also makes me think of what things are like when a woman is pregnant, that we know for the next 8 or 9 months that the child won't be born until that time. You can't force a child to be born earlier without basically killing the child or making sure that there's going to be something severely wrong with it. A birth takes as long as it takes for that child to emerge from the womb. But the whole time that we are waiting to give birth, that child exists as a shadowy, unknown potentiality inside of us, particularly if we imagine what life was like before we had the technology to reveal the gender of a child prior to its birth, and then also being able to tell if there are any conditions or malignancies that it could be born with, or any other problems going on in the womb. Prior to that, a lot of those things would have been unknown. And you think, as a mother, you're sitting there with this child growing within you, and you know nothing about it. You don't know if it's going to be a boy or a girl, and you don't know if it's even going to live. And if it is going to live, what kind of person is it going to be? Is it going to be like its mother? Is it going to be like its father? Is it going to have elements of the grandfather that you hate from several generations ago? You know, who is this child going to be? It's just this unknown that is existing within you, but which once it comes into life is going to change your whole world. And you know, a lot of pregnant women do have to diminish the amount of activity and responsibility that they take on. Many may be beset by quite extreme sicknesses that do temporarily render them invalid. And it's like that in the 12th house. We are waiting for a birth. We are waiting for something formless to take on a definite form and enter into that realm of the first house. And if we went about rushing and doing all the things that we did before, we would be probably causing harm to ourselves. And so one of the reasons the 12th house is such an uncomfortable place for many people to be is because it's a purgatory, it's a realm of in-betweens. And again, if we use that example of a woman who is pregnant, you know, there's some mixed feelings there. One part looks to the future and imagines the wonders of having this beautiful child and all of the amazing things that will come with it, and the thrill and glory of motherhood. But it will also look forward to the future and think, you know, what if I'm a bad mother? What if I don't like my child? What if we don't bond? What if, you know, this child makes my life very difficult and makes my life a living hell? There's lots of things you don't know, and therefore hopes and fears jostle with each other for the suzerainty of your consciousness. But equally, there's that tendency to look back to the past and you know, also realize that in becoming a mother, an era has ended. The era of your life where you weren't a mother, where you weren't a child, where you weren't a caregiver and a life giver, where you weren't responsible for the life of your progeny, that era has come to an end. And it might be tempting then to look nostalgically back at the past and to miss all the things we feel we might not be able to do or experience now that this child has taken a definite form. And so usually there is that sense of ambiguity, that we may yearn for something to be born, but we also might be terrified that by doing so, we are losing out on something, that we are separating ourselves from a past that we have to surrender, but which still are deeply attached to. There's a lot of confusion and overlapping arcs and narratives there that are not always easy to sit in the blurred cognitive dissonance of. But this house is also associated with faith and being a visionary, of having that ability to look into the future. You know, when we do ultrasounds on a woman's womb, we are in a sense looking to the future. If we've looked at it, we've seen the gender, that's told us something about what this tiny little seed, this tiny little embryo could become. And if we know it's a boy or a girl, we're going to then have more fantasies and ideas about what that could become. Whether those fantasies or ideas are real or not in the fullness of time is irrelevant. We are still in that headspace where we can imagine and dream what that child will become. Equally, in the past, before we had ultrasounds, you know, women would have conducted would have spoken to wise women or cunning men, or consulted witches, or used various kind of folk divination practices to try and prophesy what their child would be so they could prepare for it. There is a sense in which that ability to imagine or fantasize or have dreams about the future is something that is inherently human. And in many ways, I don't feel it really matters whether our dreams are 100% accurate. Most of the time when we have prophetic dreams, they tend to give us the essence of the thing. They tend to give us a symbolic picture of how things are that often aren't necessarily literally accurate, but very often having a dream that gives us some hope for the future is something that can motivate us tremendously. You know, if you're lonely, but you have a prophecy or a vision of marital happiness or of finding your soulmate in the future, then it gives you that hope to keep on trying. It gives you that hope to believe that my life will not always be loneliness. My life will not always be a desert of self-abandonment. but that there will be someone that I can meet and unite yourself with. If you are abandoned and unsuccessful, or haven't got the career that you want, and having dreams of the right career, of finding that place that works for you, can be the thing that motivates you to discover that. Our dreams pull us forwards into the future. And the problem that sometimes happens with 12 people is that they can become so attracted to the perfection of a dream that can't be marred because it hasn't come into existence, that they can then fear the reality. And the reality is always going to be a lesser, watered down version of what we imagined. And that we have to place a lot of faith and hope that we can live with how things are. This is something that artists struggle with perennially, where they might envisage a perfect symphony or a perfect opera, or anything, a perfect work of art, and yet even if other people love what they've produced, they still might look at it and say, that's not what it looked like in my head. There's elements of it, but it was better in my head. It takes a lot of courage to birth something that is so close to you on that imaginative level, and to accept the shortcomings it will inevitably have to encompass to exist in this realm. Earlier this year I released an album, a prog rock album called The Dream of Odysseus. And this album had been in the works for about 5 years, since the end of 2019. And once it was finally released, I had a huge sense of disappointment and rejection, because I knew that this thing that had mattered so much to me, that I had spent so long dreaming about, that the final product somehow didn't quite seem worth all of the labour and energy and money that went into it. And yet, with the fullness of time, I can see that it's something I'm glad I did, I'm proud of, and that it is true to my visions. But there is a safety in lingering in that 12th house realm, where we can't have failed because we haven't tried, where we can't have been disappointed or rejected because we haven't put ourselves in a position where we've actually ventured for any of those things that we could be rejected or accepted for. There's a safety in staying there. And I know many 12th house people who seem to linger in that place for years and years, where they might have a great novel but they don't publish it, or they have shitloads of amazing music but they never show it to that world because of that extreme fear of the failure. But eventually there will come a point where, if we are strong and courageous enough, or we have enough transits going through into our first house, that we feel strong enough to embrace that. But for people who aren't inherently 12th house natured, progressions and transits through the 12th can be difficult. Because if we think about what happens in the preceding 2 houses, it creates a very different zone for us. The 10th house is meant to represent a time where we have an achievement, where whatever we've begun in the first house finally finds its maturest and most concrete manifestation, where, let's say you have a dream to become a doctor, and you've spent all this time studying and going through med school, and then at the 10th house is where finally you become the doctor, you get the diploma, and now you can be a recognized authority figure in society. Once we get to the 11th house, we naturally start looking beyond that. It's kind of like, okay, if I've achieved something in the 10th, the 11th is asking us, what do I want to achieve next? And so a bit like the character in the tarot card of the Two of Wands, we look out to the horizon with wonder and amazement and think, okay, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. These are all my options. These are all the amazing things that I could explore. What am I going to conquer next? But once we reach the 12th house, a lot of that optimism and hope starts to fade, because we realize in order to start a whole new cycle, we can't do that without sacrificing a lot of what we've accumulated and built up from the previous cycle, that it will in essence demand that we become a new person. And almost every time we have a new transit through the first house, particularly if it's the outer planets, it can often mark a huge major phase in our identity and our way of expressing and presenting ourselves to the world. But we can only do that by letting go of who we are before. And that's not something that we can do in a brutal way. Often things have to just kind of dissolve and fall away from us. We have to spend that time losing those things and becoming spiritually naked again and clothing ourselves of all of those attachments that will prevent us from becoming who we have to be. Without going on and on about it, for me, one of the most obvious expressions of that was transitioning. And in order to become a trans woman, it meant letting go of being a man. It meant letting go of the identity and the power and the status and all the mythology I built over who I was before. And there were many times that was very difficult to do, because even if some of those things made me happy, or I could appreciate that they were outmoded or things I'd grown past, they still gave me a clarity and definition. And once you let go of that, it's almost like going back to the blank canvas, what they refer to in Taoism as being returning to the uncarved block. If the carved block is a beautiful piece of carpentry where you've made a majestic eagle, you fashioned something out of it, but if you're going back to the uncarved block, you just have a lump of wood. And going back to the 12th house, it almost feels like going back to being a blank canvas, going back to the uncarved wood, so that you can have that emptiness and formlessness that can then be reborn and rebirthed and reincarnated to take on a new form, to take on a new incarnation. And only through letting go of those old parts of myself was there enough room to embrace what I was becoming. And particularly, I had to let over rigid ideas of who I was, how I wanted to appear, the roles I wanted to play in the world, the things that I liked and hated. All of those things had to be challenged. Nothing could be held onto. Everything had to be up for grabs. And, whilst there are many things from my previous life that remain with me as recurring parts of my character, there are many things that were once vitally important to me, or which I've strongly identified with, that seem to have nothing to do with my new era and epoch and who I am now. And for many people, it's scary. It's scary letting go of a definite direction, of a definite personality, of a definite identity. It can feel like we're wandering in gloom and darkness for a long time. We might even regret the choice that we've made to approach a new direction, because even if we were unhappy with the past, it was still something definite. There's someone close to me now who is going through a 12th house transit with Jupiter going from their 12th house, and they've come out of a relationship that has lasted 11 years. And even though they had to surrender that relationship because it was an unhappy one and it was preventing them from being the fullness of their self and what they'd like to be, it still meant giving up their home. It meant giving up a relationship. It meant giving up so many definite things in their life for something that isn't established. And, once we reach the first house, we find that thing that lets us know there is a life after this. But the 12th house is closer to being that purgatory, being that place between lives where we have died in some respects, but have not yet incarnated enough to know what we are going to become. And that is the scariest place to be, because we have no guarantee that we will carry forward into that new life. We have no guarantee that what we've sacrificed will enable a rebirth. Again, to go back to the metaphor of Christ, it's like being crucified, but without the certainty that after being buried in that cave, that there is going to be a resurrection. We need hope in this house, and this is why this house involves the abandonment of logic. When we look at our life logically and analytically during that time, everything seems wrong. Nothing is satisfying our senses. Nothing is giving us that stability that would make us feel reassured. But if we get in touch with our deeper spirit, there might be that sense of hope within us that is illogical and irrational, but which ultimately is true and which gives us the strength to carry us into the future where we can become what we are next meant to become. Anyway, that's enough about the 12th house now. I've been thinking about various parts and elements and aspects of that for the last few months or so. So I thought it would be nice to share with you now, seeing as I'm trying to get back onto the treadmill of making videos regularly again. For those of you who have 12th house placements or who are going through significant 12th house transits or progressions or have done previously, feel free to share your experiences in the comments section. I would love to hear from you. I always love to hear your stories. That's how I learn. If you want to contact me for an astrological counselling session of some kind or for my advice, you can contact me at thestarsunravelled@outlook.com. I will put the address in the information section below this video. Also, at the moment, as you may have noticed, I'm kind of moving away from what I was doing a lot of last year, where I was mostly doing videos about transits and focusing just more on talking about the elements of astrology that interest me, rather than just being a mere weather reporter. So if any of you have any particular elements of astrology that you would like to have my take on, please also message me in the comments below, and if it's a subject I feel I can speak on with any degree of authority and aplomb, then I will attempt to do so. That would be a fun challenge for me, so don't feel free to share your side of things. And also, if you want to listen to the mad prog rock album that I referenced, The Dream of Odysseus, then you can listen to it on Spotify. The album is The Dream of Odysseus, and it is released under the artist name of Penelope and Odysseus.